BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. Welcome to the home of True Crime Talk Radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Tuesday, and welcome to the first edition of Serial Killer Tuesday, a new segment that has been added to Black Box Online Radio. And if you're new to this channel, every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer called Zodiac Monday, and I'm having more guests on the show now doing on-camera interviews, and please feel free to tune into that if you're curious about the Zodiac Killer case. And on Wednesdays I do a segment about Jack the Ripper called the Jack the Ripper Report, but more commonly known as Ripper Wednesday. And on Thursdays, I'm going to be doing live streams here on the channel, responding to your questions and comments, as well as talking about anything true crime or other subjects as well. People can respond to in the chat. And last Thursday, I did the first live stream, and I really appreciate everybody who tuned into that and asked some really good questions in the comment section, as well as the comment section after the episode was done. So there'll be a lot of things to respond to. And on Fridays, it's an anything goes where any subject is fair game. And on the weekends, I've been releasing chapters of the books that I've written in audiobook format. I wrote two books, Killer on a White Horse and Down the Dark Lane. They're both fictional, and I decided to just put them out on the internet for free in audiobook format, and the first couple chapters of Killer on a White Horse came out last weekend, and I'm just going to keep going until the books are finished. So there are a lot of things here on Black Box Online Radio, and if you want to follow along with these true crime cases and true crime stories, I invite you to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and some other great ways to help out the channel are by going through the links in the description box, and one of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNet88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. The subject of today's episode is the serial killer Dean Corll, who was from Texas, and he was known as the Candyman. And I have to give one shout out to Wrathchild, who suggested this as a possible topic for Black Box Online Radio. Wrathchild was in the chat on the Thursday live stream and made the request, and as you see, this is a topic that was requested by one of the listeners. So if anybody has an idea for a future episode, feel free to write that in the comments section down below, and perhaps it will be worked into Black Box Online Radio. I first learned about Dean Corll back in 2020 because I followed a program called the Serial Killer Podcast, available on Podcast One, and it is hosted by Thomas Viborg Thune. And I was a regular listener to that program, and I had been following that show for about 7 or 8 months. And I remember when I heard the story of Dean Corll on his program that it was one of the most horrific serial killer stories that I had heard. I mean, Dean Corll was not only a murderer, he was a torturer, he was an abuser, he was a pedophile. Absolutely horrific and sickening. And as I went through some material for this episode, I was reminded of a lot of those details, and not only will I be talking about Dean Corll as a serial killer, but also looking at some challenge questions, responding to some social situations around his case. But to provide the most basic introduction, I would like to go over to Murderpedia and look at the profile that has been created for Dean Arnold Corll, the serial killer who was known as the Candyman. But if you look into his story, you'll see that he also goes by the nicknames the Torture Board Killer, that is one of them, and even the Pied Piper, that's another nickname. Both of those come up a little bit infrequently, and he's definitely most famously known as the Candyman. He was a serial killer, a homosexual, rapist, and mutilator. He murdered at least 27 people, although it's almost certainly believed that he murdered over 30 people. And here's another thing that they just highlight here on Murderpedia. Dean Corll had a very short reign of terror. I mean, that we use the term reign of terror to talk about serial killers, but in reality, perhaps years of activity, years of operation, and he was only operating for roughly 3 years, and he would have definitely gone on to continue his murderous tendencies, but he passed away, and I'm giving away the ending, but in a true crime story, it's all about the facts. Dean Corll was born on Christmas Eve in 1939. He grew up in a combative home, and his parents were constantly quarreling. They were divorced. They were divorced while Dean was still an infant, and then remarried after World War II. But Dean's father provided no stabilizing influence regarding his children, with thinly veiled distaste and harsh punishments. When the couple separated for a second time, Dean Corll and his younger brother were left with a series of sitters. Their mother was working to support the family on her own. Rheumatic fever left Dean with a heart condition that resulted in infrequent absences from school, and he seemed to welcome the change. His mother remarried, moving the family to Texas, and they started a part-time business making candy, which soon expanded into their livelihood, and Corll was generous with samples that he gave to new friends. And that is how he gets the name the Candyman, because he did indeed work for this candy business. As I was going through some of the material online about Dean Corll, I found a video from Rob Dyke's channel, and it's been a long time since I've watched anything from Rob Dyke, but what you guys gotta understand is I was one of his first subscribers way back in the day. Like, when his channel was first starting out, I found a video that was put out by this guy named Rob Dyke, and I had been following a lot of countdown sites that would talk about top 10 unsolved mysteries, top 5 bizarre incidents on surveillance footage, and I noticed that Rob Dyke incorporated his personality and himself as a central figure in the storytelling operation, whereas a lot of the channels that I followed simply just talked about the cases and as an anonymous, unidentified narrator. And that was why I subscribed to his channel initially, because I wanted to to see how he would tell the stories. But over time, as the years went by, I began to notice that I started to gravitate away from his dramatic storytelling and the unnatural voice, and everything that I watched in the Dean Corll video was very well packaged. A lot of animation that was put in looked really nice, but at the same time, it does have that unnatural feel. Whereas, I guess the older I get, the more I just want to hear people talking straightforward, just give me everything. But some points that were highlighted in contrast to this Murderpedia article in his video were that, okay, Dean Corll is growing up, and his father was abusive, but his mother was actually protective of him. And one thing, though, that I've noticed about Dean Corll is that child abuse plays a very large role in how people are shaped, like, and how serial killers develop these types of destructive tendencies. But in a lot of instances, there is the case where the mother is not being protective. Maybe there's an abusive father and the mother is not protecting the children. But it seems like Dean Corll had somewhat of a reasonable relationship with his mother and a terrible relationship with his father, an abusive relationship. And when it talks about how he had this rheumatic fever issue that he had to go out of school, it seemed as though that was something that alienated him from the other students, and it affected his ability to form relationships because he's not there, he's not present, and he's not learning social skills. So he's developing this role as an outsider, someone who's disconnected from social groups. And I definitely think that played a role into the foundation of Dean Corll becoming a serial killer. And to those of you who follow BlackBoxOnlineRadio, you will know that there is a book that I quote very frequently, and it's called The Psychopath Inside by Dr. James H. Fallon. And he talks about there are 3 main characteristics of serial killers, and as a neuroscientist, which James Fallon is, he highlights 3 things in the brain specifically. Number 1, genetics. The second is neurological functioning, like the way someone's brain is actually, quote unquote, wired up. I mean, I'm saying that term loosely, as well as the flow of neurotransmitters. And then there is child abuse, and child abuse is the most significant factor that allows someone, or that would guide someone to becoming a serial killer. With Dean Corll, I think, and this is my unprofessional observation, I think that there was an overwhelming genetic component that drove him to become a serial killer. Dean Corll was a homosexual. He murdered over 30 people in a very short time frame, roughly about 3 years, and he committed the crimes by gun or by strangulation. And last week on the Tuesday show, I was talking about the Bayou Strangler, and it's a very similar story, except I think that Dean Corll was much more horrific with his torturous methods. The Bayou Strangler was Ronald Dominique, a serial killer from Louisiana who was a homosexual serial killer as well. But it's the concept of strangulation that the serial killer wants to feel the victim with his bare hands as he is murdering them. He wants to have absolute power and control over the victim. And there are some other issues, though, with Dean Corll, and that relates to his homosexuality, because I'm reminded of another serial killer story, and that is a more famous one, the story of John Wayne Gacy, who was the killer clown. And John Wayne Gacy was, for all intents and purposes, a bisexual, but he preyed on young males. Dean Corll also preyed on young males. Dean Corll would go after, it seems like, teenagers and even younger teenagers. He was indeed a pedophile. But I remember some of the discussions that we had on Black Box Online Radio back in 2019, even 4 years ago. And by we, I mean my comments on the show and also you guys in the comment section. And I made the statement that something seemed very apparent to me that John Wayne Gacy was abused by his father, and he was beaten severely by his father. His sister openly said on television in an interview that their father would beat them with a leather strap and would pay no attention to their cries or their begging for mercy or telling him to stop. He would pay no attention and would just keep beating them. That's one factor. But somebody responded by saying that John Wayne Gacy was a homosexual serial killer who preyed on boys, but he was indeed a bisexual. And it was almost as if he was ashamed of his bisexual side. He was ashamed of his homosexuality. And I think that that could somewhat be a factor with Dean Corll, the Candyman, because at the time, he was not acceptable to come out. And Dean Corll would join the military and leave his family for a while, and he would encounter homosexual behavior. He would experience homosexual intimacy, and it was just something that he had to have in the shadows, and he learned how to put his life into the shadows, or he had to learn how to hide certain aspects of his behavior. And I don't think that there is a major connection between homosexuality and serial killers. I'm making that very clear, and that goes to everything because, I mean, that's just it. Lots of people dealt with those issues, and they didn't go on to become serial killers. And there was a YouTube channel that I had watched for the first time, and it was called Manic Cadence. Manic Cadence. And I had never heard of this channel before. I watched the video on Dean Corll, and it was reasonably informative, except there was a lot of very intricate and complicated animation, and I'm not sure how much it helped the process. But one thing they said at the beginning was that Dean Corll was growing up in a very poor part of Houston. I mean, this is after he's moved with his mother and they're starting the candy business. And the candy business actually goes on to become known as the Corll Candy Company. I knew I was going to have trouble saying that, but they lived in a relatively poor part of Houston. Poverty was a big issue in that part of Texas. But the statement that was made on Manic Cadence was that lots of people were living in poverty in that part of the country, and they didn't all go on to become serial killers. In fact, a very small percentage of them would even be considered for anything to do with serial killer behavior and homicide and anything of the sort. So that's why I believe that it goes back to the statement that I made that I think Dean Corll had a genetic issue where there was something in his genes that was driving him to commit these types of crimes. And this is something that I've encountered throughout my explorations of serial killer behavior here on Black Box Online Radio, and that is that there are genetic predispositions. I mean, people have genetic predispositions for all kinds of things. Even some people have a genetic compulsion to eat more food than other people. And I believe, and it's not only that I believe this, as I said, I was citing The Psychopath Inside by James Fallon, that serial killers have a genetic predisposition to commit murder, and there actually is something in their functioning that is driving them to do this. But as far as the bizarre animation in the Manic Cadence video, I'm going to play a clip for you guys right now, and you can see what I'm talking about. And again, it's just a little bit awkward, and I don't know if it was the most beneficial thing for their presentation. So here's the clip.
Be done before that point in time. What can you the potential victim do?
Yes, the Houston Police Department was a big pile of flaming garbage, but they're not responsible here. Thousands of people grew up in Houston at that time and didn't end up strapping a bunch of boys to torture boards. Which brings us to little Dean Corll. Dean's childhood was a strange mix of red flags and bad parenting. As a kid, when Dean wasn't making jewelry from the corpses of squirrels he'd murdered, or sucking on the old trombone, or is it blowing? He was working at his mom's business, the Corll Candy Company. Dean was someone who probably would have benefited from proper sex education.
And I'm going to play one more thing for you guys. This was actually the conclusion of the episode. Again, I just think that it's a little bit of an awkward way to talk about a serial killer story. Here's their ending.
Police Chief Herman Short would resign in shame less than a year later. The true number of dead may never be known, but the official count is absolutely short of the truth, according to both Wayne and Brooks. And this is if we're going to completely ignore the years that Dean was probably perfecting his tools and rituals and burial practices in the years following his mom's departure. Brooks and Henley would get life in prison. Henley became a media whore, taking interviews every chance he got. His story would twist and turn, describing Corll as some kind of Svengali, brainwashing him, forcing his hand. Insult was added to injury when Dean Corll received a veteran's funeral, complete with a full honor guard. Nothing fucking honorable with this guy. But Henley got the COVID in prison in 2020 and died, so at least we can all feel good about that.
Now, another interesting yet terrible aspect of Dean Corll, the Candyman, is that he incorporated two participants into his operations. Two people helped him with his serial killer behavior, and their names were James Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, who is more commonly known as Wayne Henley. He had accomplices, and I remember a video that was put out on the YouTube channel Bad Things True Crime, and they talked about how serial killers frequently have partners, and it started somewhat of a debate in the comments section because people are like, wait a second, no, serial killers don't frequently have partners, and I think a lot of people took exception to the word frequently. So instead, I would like to say that more often than not, serial killers work by themselves, but it's not uncommon for a serial killer to have partners or accomplices, or there can be serial killer duos. A very clear example of this would be Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, the Boneyard Killers. And how about a lesser-known case, Robert Leroy Anderson, a serial killer from South Dakota called the Duct Tape Killer. He also incorporated partners and accomplices, and the only thing that really prevented him from killing even more was that he was caught and apprehended. And then you also have instances where it's not exactly two people who are trying to commit the murders together. You have people like David Parker Ray, the toy box killer, who had a female accomplice who would help him lure the victims back to his, well, quote-unquote torture chamber, named Cindy Hendy. And now we can even say Dean Corll, the Candyman, had accomplices. And as I said, he's also known as the torture board killer. He had a board that he would tie the victims to, and it was 7 feet long, 3 inches thick. It was made of plywood, and I'm not going to go into too many details of the torturous methods that they performed on the victims, but one of them was inserting metal rods or tubes into the urethra of the male victims. Absolutely sick and disgusting, because as previously stated, a lot of the crimes were committed by gunshot, and there's actually a video on the infographics channel about Dean Corll, the Candyman, and it talks about how, okay, I mean, some victims were killed by gunshot, other victims were killed by strangulation, but prior to the gunshots and the strangulation, the victims are going through very, very painful and horrifying acts of torture. And what Dean Corll would do is he actually had a shed that was suitable for a boat, almost like specifically referred to as a boat shed or a boat hangar. I don't want to misstate the term, so I won't say anything more than that. And the person that he was renting it from stated that it was big enough for a yacht, but she never once saw him with a boat. However, he would go by frequently, and she just thought that he was using it for storage. But that was actually the place where the bodies were dumped and buried. And I mean, and another horrific aspect of this is Dean Corll actually approached her about renting out a second shed, so you can kind of understand what was in his mind. But a big issue that we see with serial killer partnerships is there is this element of people are committing very illegal behaviors, and other people might become liabilities. And it appeared that Dean Corll's partners both wanted to turn on him, and they both didn't want to continue with the process. And Dean Corll actually had a plan to get out of Texas and move to Colorado, but some things interrupted his trajectory. And ultimately, I'll just get to the heart of the issue, and that is that Dean Corll was a serial killer who preyed on boys, and he has these two male accomplices. By boys, I mean young men. Let's just say that, young men. And one time, somebody, his accomplice Wayne Henley, brought a girl over to the house where he committed the murders, and Dean Corll was very upset about this. He's like, "Why are you bringing a girl?" Because he has no interest in her, and also, again, would view her as a liability in its own right. And then he tells them that they're going to get high by sniffing something, by huffing, and then they pass out. And at this opportunity, Dean Corll uses as an opportunity to incapacitate and more or less restrain the two people who were visiting there. There was a girl and a boy, and the female was also tied up. And again, I don't want to misstate any details, but they are both restrained in some ways. And one person who still had the ability to move was Wayne Henley. And then he picked up Dean Corll's gun, and this is the famous part where Dean Corll says, "Go ahead, shoot me, you're not going to do it." And then he shoots Dean Corll 6 times, and he killed him. And then ultimately Wayne Henley would be sent to jail and for his participation in the murders, and just said that he had to get it off his chest, he had to come clean about what happened. And I think that a lot of people were very kind of surprised by that, but at the same time, they didn't view Wayne Henley as a hero because he had been an accomplice. He'd been an active participant, even beyond accomplice. I mean, he's an active participant in these murders. And we've discussed this before in many true crime discussions, that if somebody is helping commit these murders, then he is guilty of murder as well. And Wayne Henley was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, and so was James Brooks. And they were actually sent to different prisons. And one thing that was shared on the infographics show is the female victim, who was able to survive because Dean Corll was shot, felt so conflicted about Wayne Henley for years, decades even. She was like, well, this guy saved my life, but at the same time, he also put me in the dangerous situation, and she just didn't know what to think about it. So ultimately, one day, she went to visit him in prison, and he said, "You shouldn't be thinking anything about me. I could have just as easily killed you." And I think that her response, as encapsulated by this pop culture take on the subject, was, all right, I got my answer now. He isn't actually a hero. He doesn't actually care about me. And he's a twisted and depraved individual who belongs behind bars. And ultimately, absolutely, he belonged behind bars. But there's an odd fact that I saw on the Manic Cadence channel, and that is that Dean Corll was given a full military tribute after he passed away, and they even did the 21 gun salute, and he was honored after his passing because, as previously stated, he was in the military. And that, I think, is just so bizarre. And I agree with the sentiment that was shared by the Manic Cadence channel, even though I don't necessarily agree with the method that they used to present it. But overall, what do you think of the assessment of Dean Corll so far? He is a homosexual serial killer. He's a torturer. He is someone who was perhaps very alienated and cut off from society, probably took refuge getting lost in his own mind, developed these types of thought loops about having power over people, and also he was attracted to men at a time when it wasn't acceptable to come out as gay, and definitely not in the military, so he learned how to hide certain aspects of his personality, and the candy business was absolutely influential on Dean Corll as a serial killer because he provided an explanation for him to be interacting with people and trying to lure victims, or just talking to people in a way in which he could gain their trust. He is a literal Candyman. He's given out free samples of candy to kids. And I'm reminded of another serial killer, Robert Christian Hansen, who was the serial killer from Alaska known as the Butcher Baker. And not that he gave out free samples. Robert Christian Hansen was a heterosexual serial killer that targeted prostitutes. But instead, it's about how people just didn't suspect him because he was the guy running a bakery. He was Bob the Baker. And it just comes across as such an innocent and wholesome and harmless profession, the same way that being a Candyman would be an innocent, harmless, and wholesome profession. But then Dean Corll is also just learning how to lure people toward him. He has a reason why he's talking to children and young people. He has a reason why he is going out and about and doing this type of just abnormally outgoing behavior. And it's all about just building a facade and creating this false sense of security so he can lure victims to his place, and also recruiting these two accomplices. But overall, I had heard something on the Manic Cadence channel that I had never quite heard from anybody else before, and that is that Dean Corll did a handcuff trick that was done by John Wayne Gacy. I mean, I just found it surprising that they said this. John Wayne Gacy did a handcuff trick where he would put a pair of handcuffs on and then he would slip out of them or remove them easily, and then he would tell his male victim that they should put them on. Okay, I'll show you how to do it. And then they're like, okay, well, I can't get my hands out. How do I do it? And he says, the trick is to have the key. And now they're in a vulnerable place, and he would attack them. And according to Manic Cadence, Dean Corll, as well as his accomplices, Brooks and Henley, did the exact same thing, and I hadn't heard that particular detail before. But that just goes to show that these are sexual predators. These are people who are torturous predators, and torture is definitely about power. It's definitely about enjoying sadism, like it's about sadism, enjoying the creation of pain in other people. And I think that it goes so far beyond anything to do with an upbringing or anything to do with someone's lousy childhood. This is about someone who had some very, very, very harsh and strong issues with his neurological functioning and his genetics, because the neurological functioning component is something that I haven't talked about much in this episode, and that is that the person is acting on urges and desires, and they aren't feeling empathy for the victims. They're actually experiencing decreased amygdala function. Again, in 2019, I did an episode called The Brain of a Serial Killer, and I was responding to a documentary presentation that said that a psychopathic serial killer has an amygdala that is 17% smaller than a normal functioning person, meaning they have decreased amygdala function. They have decreased emotional functioning when they are interacting with other people. They don't feel guilt or shame or remorse when they are hurting people. And the relationship to the amygdala is connected to a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, where that deals with acting on desires and urges, and they are acting on these things, but they don't feel anything for the victims, so it almost can be a form of pleasure, and so to speak, or satiation rather than pleasure, I mean, to be very precise. And I just think that Dean Corll was an extreme case of that, maybe even one of the most extreme cases. And as I said, he has murdered over 30 people. But this episode is being recorded in the year 2023, and I saw, just prior to the start of this recording, that there was a new article that came out only a couple of months ago that was talking about Dean Corll and trying to identify one of his victims. And this is from missingkids.org in their blog section, and it says, half a century after this young man was murdered in Houston, Texas, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is releasing a brand new set of images about a John Doe. In 1973, he was murdered, and they hope that this will lead to his identity. Can you help solve this 50-year-old mystery? The early 1970s in Houston Heights. It was the early 70s, and across the U.S., artists like Elton John and Led Zeppelin topped the charts. On the radio, gas prices were around 36 cents a gallon, and the big screen Marlon Brando uttered the famous words, "I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse." Just a short distance away from downtown Houston, a community called Houston Heights was filled with families. Kids rode their bikes around the neighborhood and played outside until dinner time. However, beneath the surface, this seemingly normal neighborhood had a trouble that emerged. Between 1970 and 1973, young boys and teens mysteriously vanished across the city. Although the missing reports continued to rise, the disappearances were often brushed off as runaways, leaving grieving families with unanswered questions about their missing sons. Although this was discussed in nearly every source I found about the Candyman, that the police were somewhat aware that there's this massive amount of people that are going missing, and they're trying to make these types of connections and find out who was doing it. It seemed the boys were vanishing without a trace. Within Houston Heights, an outwardly average and friendly guy, Dean Corll, worked as an electrician, and he was known as the Candyman because he had earned that nickname while working at his mother's candy company, and when he was younger. And not only did he work there, he actually went on to become vice president of the candy company at a relatively early age. Corll often handed out free candy to local children and befriended young boys in the area and allowed them to hang out in his candy shop. This was something that was discussed on both Rob Dyke's episode and Infographics, and that was that because Houston Heights had a lot of issues with poverty, the candy shop mostly stayed away from any of the trouble that you would get in other places, so people began to use it as a refuge for just kind of escaping the troubles of life for just a brief moment. However, beneath Dean Corll's facade of innocence lurked a chilling secret, one that would come to light years later: the Houston murders. On Wednesday, August 8th of 1973, police officers responded to a distress call at 2020 Lamar Street in Pasadena, Texas, where Dean Corll had moved earlier that summer. Upon arrival, investigators say they discovered 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley alongside Corll's lifeless body. Henley claimed that to the police that he shot Corll 6 times in self-defense, yet what seemed like an average homicide would become something else entirely. Henley would begin to reveal shocking secrets that would lead the police to a crime scene no one was expecting. Henley and Corll's other accomplice, 18-year-old David Brooks, led investigators to multiple grave sites across the Houston area, including a boat storage shed, Sam Rayburn Reservoir, and a beach at High Island. Each location revealed the sites out of a nightmare. And that is, of course, talking about the bodies that were buried. And I saw on Manic Cadence that they shared a fact about the removal of the corpses, and they didn't get the police officers or even the forensics teams to dig them up. They actually used a group of prisoners from, well, the prison to come out to the site, and they just gave them ordinary garden shovels and they told them to dig, and they were able to find the bodies fairly early on. They weren't very deeply buried. So that's another odd fact about this story. And can you help us solve the final mystery? Over the years, investigators were able to identify 27 of Corll's victims. Each of the lost boys has a name except one. In a new effort to bring awareness to his case, forensic artists at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created this brand new reconstruction image of what he may have looked like. According to the police, this young man was one of the 17 bodies that was found in the boat storage shed. Okay, that was perhaps the easiest way to put it. Boat hangar, I don't know what I was talking about. Boat storage shed on August 9th of 1973. Investigators believe he was between 15 and 18 years old at the time of his death, and he had likely been deceased for 12 months or more prior to his recovery. He was a Caucasian with possible admixtures including Hispanic, but investigators believe his outward appearance would have been primarily white. According to the medical examiner, he had brown hair approximately 7 inches in length. An examination revealed that he had a mild form of spina bifida, which could have caused him lower back pain, possibly affecting his stride. However, it may not have been produced by any noticeable symptoms at all. In addition to the facial reconstruction image, forensic artists at the National Center worked collaboratively with Harris County Forensic Science Institutes to create a brand new image of the John Doe. He was found wearing a brand of Catalina swim trunks that were red, turquoise, and gold in vertical stripes, and they also had dark blue. The swim trunks also had the letter C on a belt buckle. So this is just a new recent development. As I said, this only came out a couple months ago. Actually, 2 months ago. This came out in August of 2023, and it's now October. So I just wanted to share that, even a recent article about Dean Corll, the Candyman, and one of his victims. But right now, I would like to turn it over to you again. What do you think about anything that was discussed in this episode? What do you think about Dean Corll as a serial killer? Is there anything that stands out? What do you think about the comparisons that I've made between Dean Corll and other serial killers, such as the Bayou Strangler, such as John Wayne Gacy? And what do you think about the... I guess I have to ask one final challenge question, come to think, because this was something that was discussed in multiple places online, and they're saying, why wasn't this story covered? Because I encountered the same thing when I was looking into the Bayou Strangler, and that was, why isn't the story of Dean Corll, the Candyman, more widely discussed? And it wouldn't really be about how horrific he was as a serial killer, because look at John Wayne Gacy, very famous serial killer, homosexual, torturer. What about Jeffrey Dahmer, very widely discussed serial killer, homosexual, torturer, cut up the body parts, cannibalized his victims, and he did all types of experiments. I mean, more or less, for lack of a better term, experiments on the body parts. And I think that my ultimate answer is that perhaps certain cases just simply do not get covered because there are other true crime stories in the news. And also, with Dean Corll, there was no trial. Jeffrey Dahmer had a very public trial, and you can hear the victim's statements. Dean Corll was never apprehended. And a lot of what he did exists purely in the stories that we've heard from Wayne Henley. And a lot of his actions are just purely in people's imaginations. They know what he did. The 7-foot tall torture board, and as I said, I really didn't want to discuss too many of the horrific aspects of this, because YouTube just even pulls videos down for discussing content of that sort. But ultimately, I think that perhaps a lot of people just can't comprehend the story because it's bizarre, it's twisted, and it doesn't even fit with some of the narratives that have been established that a serial killer is somebody who is just like the lonely, quiet man. Instead, this is a very outgoing, but also very lonely individual who is just giving out free candy samples and then thinking about how to kill the people he's giving the samples to. Why do you think the story of Dean Corll is less widely discussed than other serial killer mysteries and cases? Okay, that's all for me now. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.